For those who need big, nay, huge sleeves and crisp white cotton in their lives, watch on, for today we begin an exploration of historicism and perception, of romanticism and Hollywood, of narrative and expression. And it all begins with some very big sleeves. Statement sleeves have been in for a couple of years now, but there's nothing new about big sleeves. Sleeves were a way to show off extravagant textiles during the Renaissance and grew to absolutely enormous size before being reined in by sumptuary laws. Big sleeves of one sort or another were all over 17th century Europe, took a break for the 18th century, only to re-emerge with a vengeance in the 1820s. Sleeves slowly shrank throughout the mid-19th century and poof, 1890s. I'd argue that the 1890s brand of gigot sleeve is probably what today's society is most familiar with, if only because it has been consistently referenced ever since. Whether on screen or in numerous modern fashion adaptations, the 1970s loved 1890 sleeves, the 1980s, and of course with the current Victorian obsession, we're seeing yet another renaissance of the big sleeve. I will be referencing all of the above. Here we have a frankly glorious example of mid-20th century historicism from the Queen of Historicism, Laura Ashley. This is obviously based on a late 18th, early 20th century shirtwaist, but obviously it's a dress length, which is something that I want to do as well. I love the styling here, but I do want to learn to draft an actual shirtwaist. So I located an Edwardian drafting manual on archive.org from about 1911, I think. So I'm going to be following the instructions from the manual, but keeping all of this styling in mind as I draft something that's kind of 1890s meets 1980s. This was conceived as a part of a bigger project, which had a lot to do with a production that is currently entangled in the writer's strike. So this garment itself can kind of stand alone, but I do want to keep the other project in mind because this needs to be sort of like an under thing for it. I will link the actual drafting manual below if anyone out there would like true instructions. I created the basic bodice shape from the manual, lengthened to mid-calf length. I took out all of the waist shaping. I referenced the examples at the Met and spread the pattern to include 3 large tucks at the front and 2 at the back. I will absolutely never understand Victorian collar instructions, so I used the pattern pieces for the collar stand and collar from the Laura Ashley pattern. By 1911, the sleeve pendulums had swung back to fitted, so I slashed and spread the sleeve cap to make it nice and poofy. There is something truly iconic about a crisp white button-up shirt. So I used a huge bedsheet that I'd had kicking around for a bit. This particular bedsheet was nice and tightly woven, similar to the couple of Victorian shirtwaists I've seen in person. One of the tucks has a hidden dart inside, so I began construction by sewing this dart, wrong sides together, meaning that the dart was to the outside of the garment. I sewed the tucks right sides together, putting the ridges of the tucks to the inside of the garment, and enclosing the dart. I drafted a 1-inch center front button placket directly into the front panels of the dress. I pressed a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the right side of the over placket, or the side of the placket which will get buttonholes. I then pressed the 1-inch placket to the right side. This brought it awkwardly close to the centermost tuck, but at least for the moment I ignored that fact. I do not care for modern plastic interfacing, so instead I used a piece of the self fabric cut to a 1-inch strip along the warp and heavily starched. I slipped this inside the placket and edge stitched along the fold, and top stitched along the edge to keep things crisp. I did the same for the under placket, or the side that will get buttons, except I pressed the under placket to the wrong side to keep from having a placket that is overall too bulky on the right side. I don't have any shirtwaists in my collection, but I do have several lingerie dresses, which, since they are single-layer construction, I would imagine use similar construction techniques. Most of the seams are French seamed, which is great, except that I naturally decided to include a pocket in the side seam of my dress, which makes the French seaming process a bit more complicated. I added additional seam allowance to the pocket area following my no seam allowance near disaster from my last project. Only to realize I didn't need additional seam allowance. Only to realize I needed additional seam allowance on the actual pocket bag, just not on the side seam of the garment. After recutting the pocket bag, I matched the pocket bag to its place along the front panel's side seam, wrong sides together, and stitched 1/4 inch from the edge. I trimmed this seam allowance to about 1/8 inch, leaving the rest of the side seam's seam allowance intact. I then pressed the pocket to the right side and sewed in another 1/4 inch to create a French seam. I should have now pressed the French seam towards the pocket bag. Oops. I repeated this for the back. I laid the now structurally complete front panels against the back panels, wrong sides together, and stitched the side seams, including the pocket bags, at 1/4 inch. This first pass didn't enclose all the raw bits from the pocket. I clipped the corners of the pocket bag, trimmed the seam allowance to 1/8 inch, and flipped the dress inside out to press the side seams right sides together. I stitched in another 1/4 inch to create the French seam, which did enclose all the raw bits this time. Et voila! Nice, clean French seamed pocket. Only a mild pita. I attached the shoulder seams with another French seam. I created another interfacing piece for the collar band, but this time I basted it to the wrong side of the collar band. I placed this against the neck edge, wrong sides together. Okay, so I just went to try this thing on for the first time, and I did all these calculations to put a placket on the front and everything, and I realized that I did not double the placket length in the front. In my mind, like, this somehow worked out because I was like, oh, like I'm going to overlap it, and I don't know. But anyway, so I only added 1 inch when I should have added 2. So like this closes like exactly where it's supposed to on me. It just like butts up against each other, which means that my collar is not really going to work. And also my button placket is not going to work. And I remember that I already had like this weirdness happening right here with the tuck on one side that, you know, it's like super awkwardly close to the button placket. So I'm taking that out, and that's giving me like an extra inch of space. So I think that's gonna fix this. It's gonna be kind of funky at the neckline because like it's shaped for the tuck. But I don't know, I'm hoping I can kind of just like work that into the seam allowance somehow. I unpicked the front tucks at center front to give me back about 1 inch on both sides. This enables the collar stand to fit perfectly, which I promptly stitched in place. I basted another interfacing piece to the wrong side of the top collar, placed the under collar right sides together with the non-interfaced side of the top collar, and stitched around all but the neck edge. I flipped the collar right sides out. For fabric economy's sake, I had a center back seam on the under collar, but it did end up adding some bulk to the collar. Not world-ending or anything, but next time I think I'll just be fabric uneconomical. I pressed the collar with the outer edges slightly rolled so that the seam won't sit right along the edge of the collar. I pinned this to the collar band with the under collar to the right side of the collar band and basted the collar in place. I pressed a 1/2 inch seam allowance to the wrong side of the under collar band and pinned the under collar band right sides together to the top edge of the collar to sandwich the collar between the top and under collar bands. I sewed through all layers. Initially, I drafted the collar band to be square like the extant Victorian examples, but I decided to round the center front edges like a modern men's shirt. Pressed all the rawness to the inside of the collar band and hand-stitched the pre-pressed seam allowance to the inner neck edge. I then went around the collar band with a top stitch to keep things as flat as possible. The sleeves I drafted were pretty symmetrical, but best to treat them as a right and a left sleeve from the beginning. I like to pull them apart and lay them as a reflected pair first thing. I then folded each in half and pinned the long seam, leaving 4 inches free at the wrist. I sewed these with a French seam. While I was at it, I stitched 2 lines of gathering threads along the sleeve cap at about 1/8 inch and 1/4 inch. I don't see any contrasting cuff plackets on the Victorian examples, so I used this as my excuse to do a simple bias binding placket, which is my preference anyway. I lined up an unfolded piece of 1/2 inch double folded bias binding against the cuff slit right sides together. I stitched this along the binding fold, holding the cuff slit open to a straight line. I then folded the binding around the raw edge and hand cranked a stitch in the ditch along the seam to catch the inside fold of the binding. I stitched a couple of stitches along the diagonal of the corner of the binding to help the whole thing sit flat. By the way, if you are wondering why I've been hand cranking so many things lately, it is because this is my industrial machine and I love her and she's beautiful and her mechanisms work so nicely and reliably. Very privileged to have her, but she has a clutch motor, which means that she has 2 speeds. She's either stopped or she's going 50 plus miles an hour. And there's like a little speed adjustment thing in it, but it doesn't really do much, which is great if you are in an industrial setting and you're just sewing straight seams all day, which is what she's made for, then it's wonderful, but not so great if you are doing detailed work, which is what I tend to do. I've been doing some research lately, and I think I'm going to replace her clutch motor with a servo motor, which is a little bit less powerful, but has a speed dial on it and is much quieter. I actually already have the servo motor, so I'm definitely going to replace her motor. I was thinking that maybe because it's going to take me a while to release the rest of the videos for this project, that I may insert like a little workroom vlog upgrade video, just because there's a few different changes around here that I kind of want to make. And also I've never really shown off my workroom space, so may as well do both in one video. Kind of selfish. I want the like reliability and beautiful mechanics of a industrial machine, but the control of a domestic. So we'll see if I can make that happen. My cuffs were just rectangles the length of the cuff edge and 3.5 inches tall. I basted interfacing to the outer cuff piece, placed the undercuff to the right non-interfaced side of the top cuff, and sewed along the 2 short sides and 1 long edge. I trimmed the excess seam allowance from the corners to make them nice and crisp and pointy. I placed the top cuff along the cuff edge of the sleeve, right sides together, and sewed. Doing this is kind of awkward. You have to hold the undercuff outwards to get right to the edge, since you're basically sewing the whole thing from inside the cuff. I pressed the seam allowance to the inside of the cuff. I stitched the undercuff to the inside of the cuff edge by hand. Now onto the main point of the whole look. I pulled my gathering threads to gather the floofy sleeve cap. I placed the right side out sleeve into the inside out body so that the right sides were together. When I drafted the sleeve, I included notches where the gathering should begin and end, with accompanying notches on the arm side, so I matched up the notches to the underarm of the body, right sides together. I fiddled with the gathering until the cap fit evenly into the armhole and the gathers at least had the appearance of being even. I prefer to stitch gathered sleeves with the gathers on top so that I can really control how the gathers are stitched down. So the time has come to finish the armhole seam in the dress, and this is always a question even in modern sewing. How do I finish this seam? I usually do it with a flat felled seam or a binding, depending on what the ease of the sleeve situation is. But I actually have two interesting examples here. Oh, by the way, yeah, this is a clean table, but I have a skin condition that's flaring up at the moment, so I'm using a nitrile glove when looking at these. So I have two interesting examples from the Victorian period just to kind of see how the Victorians would have done it. Most of the examples, by the way, are just left raw, which is, I guess, an option if you have a tightly woven, nice cotton, but I think that mine would fray a little bit too much. So this one actually has like a very loose buttonhole around it. Well, in some places it's like a buttonhole, and in some places it's just whipped around. So there's an option, I guess. This example I thought was really interesting because this is actually serged. Interesting, right? I think that we always forget that the serger or marrow machine was invented in the mid-19th century. So Victorians had access to sergers and they definitely used them. So serging for this would be a historically correct option. I personally don't care for serged seams that much, so I'm not going to do that. But I think I am going to see if I can do like a little buttonhole stitch. I mean, I can always go over it later on with a binding if it doesn't work out or if it ends up fraying. So I think I'm going to try this out and just see if that works for mine. I trimmed the seam allowance to about 1/4 inch and sewed a tight blanket stitch over the raw edge using a double strand of buttonhole twist thread. As of right now, this is still how the arms are finished, but 100% I will be binding these sleeves in the near future. My existential crisis for this project is coming in the form of hem length, because I cut this quite long, but now that I'm looking at it in the mirror, it's a little too long. It's looking very frumpy, I guess is the nicest word that I can come up with to describe it. So I don't know, I've played around at this point with probably 15 different hem lengths. So here she is right now, and she is actually looking very cute. Now that I'm looking at her through the phone, through the mirror, I'm seeing the whole thing in a different perspective, and it's actually looking quite nice. I tried a higher length, like just above the knee. It kind of felt very like Free People. And I'm having this crisis right now because I'm like, does the longer length look cute and sophisticated and bring it to a different place? Or does it just make it look like a tent? It's looking very much like a lab coat at the moment, but I think that that's just because I have something under it and you can see it, so it's just reading coat. But now that I'm looking at it from this perspective, I think that this length is actually great. And so I'm going to chop it off to this length and give her a nice hem, and that will be this part of the ensemble and project. I accordingly chopped off the bottom 3.5 inches. Of course I wanted a nice wide hem, but my usual deep hem facing would have really made this look like a bedsheet. Instead, I sewed a 2-inch strip of bias tape to the hem edge, right sides together. I pressed this to the wrong side to enclose the raw hem edge, with a tiny lip of self to the inside to keep the edge seam from showing to the right side of the hem. I had pre-pressed a 1/4 inch seam allowance to the wrong side of the bias tape, so I repressed this and pinned it in place. I sewed along the folded edge. I tucked in the edges and again hand cranked the ends to keep them nice and neat. Hand-sewn buttonholes are on my skill wish list. Until I can get that skill down with some degree of confidence, it's machine-sewn buttonholes on my little domestic. These were sewn on the top placket at about 1¼ inches apart. The buttonhole at the collar band is horizontal, which gives the neckband a tiny amount of ease, and the rest of the center front buttonholes are vertical, which helps them sit flat. I also put 2 horizontal buttonholes on each cuff. I really want to learn how to do hand buttonholes. These were pretty rough. Poor things. I used pearlized 4-hole buttons, which were the closest thing to the Victorian versions I could source locally. I attached them by hand using 4-plied buttonhole twist thread. Fun story, one of my first jobs in fashion was at a bespoke tailor shop on Manhattan's Lower East Side. And one of my main jobs, besides shuttling fabric and patterns around the 5-borough area, was sewing buttons. I've sewed a lot of buttons. Perhaps the Victorians, like the designers of the mid-20th century, were looking back, trying to recapture an imagined pre-industrialized simplicity of life. I mean, they definitely were, but maybe the gigot sleeves of the 1890s and 1970s and 80s were a direct reference. Maybe fashion is always flowing towards and away from the body like the tide from the shore, and the departure and renewal of huge sleeves is equally inevitable. I can say with confidence that I found it highly soothing to step away from micro-trends and focus on clothes that have proven to stand the test of time. The rest of this project will trickle out eventually, but in the meantime I've got another couple of projects in the works, including the promised workroom upgrade. If you enjoyed this video, I always appreciate a thumbs up, and hit subscribe if you'd like to come along on further explorations of timeless fashion. Bye!